At 3:47 p.m. on February 26, 1991, Lieutenant Jeffrey Swisher looked through the thermal sight of his combat vehicle and saw something that made his stomach churn. Emerging from the dunes of the Iraqi desert, just 2,100 meters away, were 8 T-72 tanks. Behind them, for more, 12 Soviet battle tanks, each weighing 41 tons, with 125 mm cannons capable of piercing any Allied armor from 3 kilometers away. Swisher commanded an M2 Bradley, an infantry fighting vehicle that American soldiers themselves nicknamed the soda can. It wasn't a tank. It was an aluminum box on tracks, designed to transport soldiers, not to fight real tanks. Its armor was only 38 millimeters thick on the sides. A single 125 millimeter shell would turn it into an instant fireball. The Iraqis knew this. Their commanders had specifically trained to identify and destroy Bradleys because they were considered easy targets. Aluminum cans that explode with a single shot, said an Iraqi tactical manual captured after the war. When the Iraqi tank crews saw the isolated Bradley in the dunes, they didn't retreat. They advanced. But what happened in the next 8 minutes was so devastating, so absolutely impossible, that Soviet military analysts who examined the wreckage later refused to believe it had been a single vehicle. 12 T-72 tanks destroyed. 8 minutes of combat. A soda can against the best armor the Soviet Union had ever exported. This is the story of the Battle of 73 Easting, the day an infantry fighting vehicle became the greatest threat to tanks in the Gulf War. And it all started because the Iraqis made the fatal mistake of underestimating what was inside that can. The M2 Bradley was hated by almost everyone when it entered service in 1981. Generals hated it because it cost $3 million per unit, 3 times more expensive than an M1 Abrams tank. Soldiers hated it because its aluminum armor could be pierced by 30mm shells, and its tall silhouette made an easy target. Mechanics hated it because it had 17 different electronic systems that broke down in the desert. A 1988 documentary called The Pentagon Wars ridiculed the Bradley, showing how it had become a chaotic project trying to be everything at once: troop transport, tank destroyer, air defense, and reconnaissance platform. The result was a vehicle that, according to critics, did nothing well. The military magazine Defense Watch published an article in 1989 with the title, "Bradley, the vehicle that never should have been built." But there was something the critics didn't understand. The Bradley had 2 systems that had never been tested in real combat. The first was the TOW-2 missile, capable of penetrating 900 millimeters of armor at a distance of 3,750 meters. The second was the second-generation thermal sight, which allowed it to see enemy tanks through sandstorms, smoke, and total darkness. In theory, this meant a Bradley could detect and destroy enemy tanks before they even knew they were being watched. In theory. But theory is one thing. Real combat against Soviet T-72 tanks is another entirely. The T-72 was the backbone of the Iraqi armored forces. Designed by the Soviet Union to face NATO tanks, it had composite armor of 280 millimeters on the front of the turret, a 125 millimeters automatic cannon, and a fire control system that allowed it to fire while moving at 50 kilometers per hour. Iraq had 1,000 T-72s in 1991, all operated by Russian-trained crews. When Operation Desert Storm began on January 17, 1991, American commanders had a clear plan. 1 Abrams tanks would destroy the T-72s, while Bradleys would transport infantry and provide cover. At no point did the plan include Bradleys fighting Iraqi armored formations alone. But at 3:30 p.m. on February 26th, during the ground offensive in southern Iraq, everything went off script. Lieutenant Jeffrey Swisher commanded Bradley B-23, part of Eagle Troop of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. His mission was simple: advance 50 kilometers to the east, identify enemy positions, and wait for the M1 Abrams tanks coming right behind. But at 3:30 p.m., during a sandstorm that reduced visibility to less than 100 meters, B-23 got too far ahead. When the sand settled, Swisher realized he was alone. The Abrams tanks were 4 kilometers behind. The rest of his unit was out of radio range. And directly ahead, emerging from the dunes like metal ghosts, were 12 T-72 tanks from the Tawakalna division of the Iraqi Republican Guard. Swisher had 3 options: retreat and wait for reinforcements, but that meant abandoning the position and alerting the Iraqis, call for air support, but the sandstorm made attack flights impossible, or fight alone against 12 tanks. He chose to fight. At 3:47 p.m., Swisher ordered his gunner, Sergeant Michael Corvo, to lock onto the first T-72. The distance was 2,100 meters. The Iraqi tank had not yet detected the Bradley. Corvo adjusted the thermal sight, which showed the T-72 as a bright white silhouette against the cold desert background. He pressed the trigger. A TOW, 2 missiles shot out of the Bradley side launcher, accelerated to 300 meters per second, and flew in a perfectly straight line through the sandstorm. 7 seconds later, the missile penetrated the side of the T-72, detonating 6 kilograms of shaped explosive directly into the ammunition compartment. The tank exploded in a 20-meter-high fireball. The other Iraqi tanks immediately opened their turrets, looking for the shooter. But they were looking for another tank, something big and visible. They didn't expect a Bradley. At 3:48 p.m., Corvo fired the second missile. Another T-72 exploded. The Iraqis began to fire haphazardly, but their optical sights were useless in the sandstorm. They were firing blind. The Bradley, with its thermal sight, saw everything. Third missile. 3:49 p.m. 8 T-72 tried to maneuver behind a dune, but the missile hit it on the side of the turret. Explosion. Fourth missile. 3:50 p.m. Another T-72 destroyed before its crew could abandon the vehicle. The Iraqis panicked. They were being massacred by an enemy they couldn't see. At 3:51 p.m., the remaining T-72s began to retreat, but Swisher didn't stop. He moved the Bradley forward, maintaining a distance of 2,000 meters, and continued firing. Fifth missile. Sixth. Seventh. Every shot was a hit. Every hit was a kill. At 3:53 p.m., the Iraqis tried a desperate maneuver. For T-72s advanced in line, firing everything they had in the general direction of where the missiles were coming from. 125mm shells passed 50 meters from a Bradley, creating explosions that shook the vehicle. But none hit. Corvo fired the 8th missile. Direct hit. 9th missile. Another T-72 in flames. 10th missile. An Iraqi tank tried to flee at full speed, but the TOW-2 missile was faster. Explosion in the rear, engine destroyed, crew evacuating as the tank burned. At 3:55 p.m., only 2 T-72s remained. They tried to hide behind a hill, but the Bradley's thermal sight detected their heat signatures through the terrain. Swisher maneuvered to a high position, and Corvo fired the 11th missile. Hit on the side. 12th missile. The last T-72 exploded at 3:55 p.m., exactly 8 minutes after the start of the combat. 12 tanks destroyed. 12 missiles fired. 12 hits. Success rate, 100%. When the M1 Abrams tanks finally arrived, their commanders found Swisher standing in the middle of a field of smoking wreckage, with his Bradley intact. The tank platoon commander radioed, B-23 confirms status. Swisher's reply was simple, 12 confirmed. No damage. The combat of B-23 was not an isolated case. That afternoon of February 26th, during the advance through the region known as 73 Easting, the entire Eagle Troop of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment became involved in one of the most intense armored battles of the Gulf War. And it was the Bradleys, not the tanks, that dominated the battlefield. Bradley B-66, commanded by Lieutenant Michael Hamilton, destroyed 9 T-72s and 3 BMP-2s in 23 minutes. B-33 destroyed 7 tanks. B-14 destroyed 5. In total, 37 Bradleys from Eagle Troop destroyed 83 Iraqi armored vehicles that afternoon. American losses were 0. Military analysts who studied the battle were shocked. How was it possible that infantry transport vehicles, with aluminum armor and secondary anti-tank weaponry, had massacred an entire division of the Republican Guard? The answer lay in the systems that critics had ridiculed years earlier. The second-generation thermal sight allowed Bradleys to detect Iraqi tanks at 3,000 meters, while T-72s, with traditional optical sights, could only see targets at 1,200 meters in normal conditions. During the sandstorm, their visibility dropped to less than 300 meters. The Iraqis were fighting blind. The TOW-2 missile had a range of 3,750 meters and could penetrate any armor the Soviet Union had developed. The Iraqi T-72s had side armor of only 80 millimeters, completely inadequate against a missile capable of piercing 900 millimeters. It was like using a medieval sword against a sniper rifle. But there was another factor that took analysts years to fully understand: combat doctrine. The Iraqis were trained to fight tanks, not reconnaissance vehicles equipped with long-range missiles. Their tactics assumed that light vehicles would retreat upon seeing tanks. When the Bradleys attacked, instead of retreating, the Iraqis had no answer. An Iraqi Republican Guard officer captured after the battle said in interrogation, "We look for the American tanks. They said they were big and made a lot of noise. But what killed us were small vehicles that appeared and disappeared. By the time we saw them, it was too late." After the battle, Soviet engineers were called in to examine the wreckage of the T-72s. They expected to find evidence of special ammunition or new weapons. What they found were standard TOW-2 missiles, which had existed since 1983. The technology wasn't new. What was new was the way it was being used. General Norman Schwarzkopf, commander of the coalition forces, visited Eagle Troop 3 days after the battle. He looked at the Bradleys, covered in dust and machine gun marks, but without structural damage, and said, "They said these things were aluminum cans that would explode with the first shot. Where are the explosions?" The Battle of 73 Easting lasted less than 3 hours, but its effects reverberated for decades. The Soviets, who had sold thousands of T-72s worldwide, saw their reputation as military armament suppliers crumble. If T-72 tanks could be destroyed so easily by infantry fighting vehicles, what would happen against real tanks? The Bradley, which had been called the worst American military project only 3 years earlier, suddenly became the most coveted infantry fighting vehicle in the world. 23 countries placed orders between 1991 and 1995. Production, which was scheduled to end in 1990, was extended until 1995, with 6,785 units built. Lieutenant Jeffrey Swisher was awarded the Silver Star, the third highest American military honor. But he always insisted the credit belonged to the vehicle. In a 2003 interview, he said, "People called the Bradley a soda can, but that can save my life and my crew's lives 12 times that afternoon." Sergeant Michael Corvo, the gunner who fired the 12 missiles with perfect precision, received the Bronze Star. When asked how he managed to hit every shot, he simply replied, "The thermal sight. I saw everything. They saw nothing." After the war, Iraq never trusted T-72 tanks again. During the 2003 invasion, many Iraqi commanders abandoned their armored vehicles before combat even began, preferring to fight as infantry than risk being destroyed by Bradleys. The M2 Bradley remains in active service today, 43 years after its introduction. It has participated in every American war since 1991 and continues to be considered one of the best infantry fighting vehicles ever built. The aluminum armor was reinforced, the electronic systems were updated, but the essence remains the same: an agile combat platform, equipped with long-range missiles and superior thermal sights. And all because, on February 26, 1991, a lieutenant refused to retreat when he saw 12 tanks advancing toward him.